if you look at what happened in other Central European countries, you would see that the events in Poland, so the events in 1989 gave rise to a chain reaction. Hungary and Czechoslovakia followed the path, and in 1990 they celebrated the first free parliamentary elections. The political change brought about the economic transformation. And let me show you here what we can call the initial conditions of economic transition in Central Europe. What do I mean by those initial conditions? Well, those are the states of Central European economy prior to the introduction of economic reforms. What all those countries had in common was the industry overgrown and the dependence on Soviet market for exports. However, there were significant differences, and let us start with Hungary. Hungary came better prepared for what was to happen than other two countries, because the reforms that were introduced in 1960s were never fully reverted. So in reality, there were already price and trade liberalizations, which can explain why the level of administered prices is significantly lower in Hungary than in Poland or Czechoslovakia. Hungary also managed to introduce two-tier bank system and a tax reform prior to 1989. Interestingly, Hungary, just like Poland, had a very big external debt. However, the debt in Poland was far greater, and in Poland it was the consequence of this massive borrowing that we just talked about, the borrowing that took place in 1970s. Poland, contrary to two other countries, had also a private agricultural sector, and this is why this state ownership is only at the level of 70%, in relation to 90% in Hungary and 100% in Czechoslovakia. When I say that there existed private agriculture, what I mean is that around 78% of Polish arable land was in private hands. However, those were fairly small and fragmented forms. What was very typical to Poland, and only to Poland, was huge money overhang. And the term money overhang is used to describe the situation in which people have money holdings, but they have them because they have no possibility to spend them. So this is the result of shortages, and this is the situation typical to Poland. The last case is Czechoslovakia here. By the way, I use the term Czechoslovakia right now. Later I will be talking about Czech Republic and Slovakia, because those countries were joined together and existed as Czechoslovakia till the end of 1992. Well, Czechoslovakia was an interesting case because after the spring of 1968, the country reverted to most orthodox, centrally planned economy. So structurally speaking, it was very badly prepared for what was to happen. However, and a little bit paradoxically, on the eve of 1991, so just before the reform was introduced, Czechoslovakia enjoyed very favorable initial external and internal macroeconomic conditions, which can be illustrated by a small money overhang and low ratio of external debt. So once we describe the initial conditions, I think that now we can go into the analysis of strategies. And the choice of the strategies, as you will see, depended on those initial conditions. Well, take Hungary. In Hungary, as we just said, the reform started earlier. And so Hungary adopted something that is called a gradualist program. This means that one reform is introduced, and then the other, and then the other. So there is time to adjust in a way. This gradualist program in Hungary involved small devaluation, further liberalization of prices, and this all was happening under a fairly restrictive fiscal and monetary policy. Poland and Czechoslovakia were at very different situation. Well, the initial conditions were were totally different than in Hungary. So both countries adopted a different strategy, and this strategy is called shock therapy. Some people call it Big Bang move. And Poland was the one that actually started, so let me focus a little bit more on Poland. The main idea behind this shock therapy is to liberalize everything at once. And I know it sounds like a simplification, but the main concept is that in order for this reform to be successful, it is necessary to proceed as fast as possible on 3 levels. So we need to introduce reforms regarding macroeconomic stabilization. We need to introduce reforms regarding microeconomic liberalization. And finally, we need to introduce reforms regarding institutional restructuring and do it quickly. And this is exactly what happened in Poland. In this table, what you can see is what happened. I would like to draw your attention to 2 interesting set of data. Well, firstly, what we can see is a very high ratio of very high ratio of CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, 640% in Poland in 1989. So, to put it simply, it's just a hyperinflation in Poland. The second aspect that is very visible here is the drop in output in all countries. The GDP drop starting in 1990. Let's start with hyperinflation in Poland. This was the result of a number of factors, but there are 2 that deserve more attention probably. The first is so-called marketization of agriculture. In 1989, the prices of food were freed, and immediately they went up by 40%. And this problem that originated in the inflation regarding the food products was further fueled by the wage increase, and this increase was the result of what we actually mentioned a couple of moments ago. It was the result of general wage and income indexation system. So the system that was forced through during the roundtable negotiations by the opposition. And so this is quite an interesting case here. Well, as for the GDP drop, as you will see on the slide, it was a kind of a universal consequence of the transition, and there were a number of factors that were responsible for this. I would like to enumerate 3 of them. The first kind of obvious cause of this GDP drop was the industry shrunk. There was a necessity to modernize. There was a necessity to introduce restructuring policy. And yet again, if you compare what was happening in Central Europe to what actually already happened in Western Europe, you would see that a kind of a natural process of deindustrialization, which started in Western Europe in 1970s or 1980s, in Poland could only start after the collapse of the regime. The second reason why the GDP dropped was the collapse of Comecon. And Comecon was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. This was, if I may say, a form of economic organization, kind of integrative arrangement of the countries that existed within the communist bloc. And it was very important because if you look at the data from the late 1980s, you would see that between 40 and 60% of the exports from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland went exactly to Comecon. So the drop, the composition of the Comecon system was definitely a big problem from the point of view of trade relations. And the third reason why the GDP dropped was of more general nature, and we can describe this as a lack of stability, which meant that many investors, many economic actors adopted the strategy to just wait and see. Another interesting consequence of transition, and interesting from socio-economic point of view, would be the rise of inequality, as illustrated by the rising levels of Gini coefficient in all transition economies. And now you may ask the question, okay, so was this transition in Central Europe successful? And I think that despite many political, economic, social problems that are still to be resolved, and we are still actually coming back to the whole process of transition, I think that despite those problems, the transition was very successful in all of those countries. Why? Because they managed to change from centrally planned socialist economy to market economy. They did not stuck somewhere in between, which was the situation for some other countries.